Welcome to part two of this presentation. If you remember, in part one, we got to this point. We're still at the point of prediction. We're still looking at some ways to increase levels of learner engagement with text through, at this point, through predicting the likely content of the text. We're not really focusing on linguistic content so much as concepts, ideas, focusing very much on meaning at this point. This is where we got to in part one. I can reveal to you at this point the actual answers from the original text. Remember, we haven't seen the text yet. That will come in a moment. I also stressed in part one the importance of making it clear to students that it's not a question of correct or incorrect. Students may come up with perfectly acceptable possible answers to go in each of these spaces, possible words or phrases, which make sense in terms of the meaning and make grammatical sense as well. Just because that they may not actually be the versions or the forms which appear in the original text, and that's not something that students should be in any way punished for. So here are the answers. I wonder how well you did, at least in terms of predicting the general meaning, general context of these answers. Okay, so that's the end of the pre-reading and pre-listening part of the webinar. We're going to move on to the section I've called while reading or while listening. While reading activities, while listening activities in English language teaching course books typically consist very much of asking students to find the answers to pre-written questions, comprehension questions. Fine in terms of testing understanding, but these are very artificial tasks, however, in relation to the real world. When we read texts in our own first language, we don't do so with a list of pre-written comprehension questions in front of us. A much more authentic task for students to undertake while reading or while listening, which reflects much better the way we might approach reading or listening text in our own language, is to ask students to track their own response to what they read. Common examples of responses to what we read or what we hear are agreement, disagreement, interest, surprise, even more extreme reactions such as anger or disbelief. Emotional reactions. When we read something, when we listen to something, our emotions are stirred. If they're not stirred, you could ask, well, why are we reading it? Why are we listening to it? The reason for reading or listening to something is to stir, to ignite our emotions in some way. So an authentic and a more meaningful task to give to students may be what I've called a reader response task. This requires students to mark sections of the text with symbols to represent and indicate their emotional response to different sections of the text. Here are some simple examples. So I've gone for things that stimulate a positive response in terms of liking something, a more extreme reaction, negative reaction of anger. I don't understand. Just one point to mention about this, I'm not talking about the language, the vocabulary, so much as the ideas and the concepts in the text. And surprise as well. Also important, I think, to make it clear that we're not trying to impose emotions onto our students. Students may not, in fact, feel any of these emotions, and of course, they may feel other emotions as well. I think that's fine. Any conscious observation by our students of the emotions that they're feeling when they read or listen to English text must be a positive thing as far as engagement with the text is concerned, and in terms of interaction with the text and memory of the content and the language within it. Okay, so having talked with students about the idea of the reader response, we can even get the students to invent the symbols themselves. They could suggest other emotions, so it can be as open as we wish. Then, of course, we get to the point of reading the text. So the text in question. So this is the text which goes with the first headline that we saw, the fun route to fitness. I won't stop long enough for you to read the text at this point, but it's here if you would like to read it later. The other text here, this is the Battle of the Lifestyles. Notice that I've changed the title because the title as it exists here is a little limited in terms of what we can do with it for prediction purposes. And then the Great Brown Gold Global Takeover. Brown gold, of course, is coffee. I wonder if you correctly predicted that. So the reader response. I think when we read or listen in our first language, typically we reflect on the themes or the threads of meaning contained in what we've read or what we've heard, and this tends to be in the form of an internal monologue. If this internal monologue is also something that continues after the reading or after the listening in a second language, it's likely to take place in the first language, I think, rather than in the language of the text. So for this reason, I think a more useful activity in class is perhaps to externalize this process of reflection by, for example, asking students to work in pairs or in small groups and to discuss or compare their personal reader response. Of course, we're not looking necessarily for students to have the same emotional reaction or even have a different emotional reaction. I think it's just interesting in itself to compare the emotional reactions. And I would also suggest giving students some kind of task to find emotions they have in common with their partner when reading or listening to a particular text, or emotions that they feel are opposites of each other. And similarly, I think engagement levels can be further increased perhaps by asking students to write their own reflection activities or discussion activities, questions for each other. Okay, so let's imagine that we've now read the text, we've prepared for the reading or the listening, and then we've read it or we've listened to the reading, the audio recording of the text. So students at this point are very familiar with the content in terms of the concepts, the ideas expressed in it, which is great. But as language teachers, sooner or later, if texts are to be used as vehicles for language learning, then at some point there almost certainly needs to be a focus on form of some kind. This could be lexical or phonological or grammatical, of course. And remember that at this point students have already been quite heavily exposed to the texts, so they are pretty familiar with the content. So simple examples. First of all, a simple focus on form is to take several sentences in the text, present them to students and mix them up. Mix up the words, mix up the phrases, and ask students to unjumble one. Here is one example from the battle of the lifestyles. Depending on the level of challenge that you want to present to the students, the learners in your class, you can keep the words as individual words, or you can keep some chunks, some combinations like urban lifestyles in this case also help. That's a decision that is you're free to make. In any case, the activity does have the benefit of training students to organise language into chunks, into blocks, which is a vital but, in my opinion, frequently neglected skill. Here is the answer. If you wish to raise the level of challenge, you can present students with longer sentences, of course. Here is the answer to this one. This is from the Fun Route to Fitness text. And you can experiment a little with the task types. A more challenging variation on the activity perhaps is to add an extra unnecessary word, a false word, into the group of tiles that you have here. So in this first group at the top, there is one word which is extra, which is unnecessary. And the task is for students to identify that word whilst they're reordering the words. This is very effective if you want to draw attention to a specific language point or to a common error which you know your students typically make. The same with the second part of the sentence at the bottom here. Again, there is an extra word in here. I can reveal the answers to you. So the extra words are the word more and the word the. So I'm sure you can see that in this case, very good way to draw attention to a common mistake that students may have with the formation of comparative adjective forms. And in this one, a little bit more challenging, I think, but again, a useful way to draw students' attention to use of articles, definite articles, typical errors that they may make when using articles. By drawing their attention to the article error, the hope is that they'd be less likely to repeat that error in the future. And a variation on this is to do the opposite, to take away one word from the sentence. So in this case, here is the sentence at the top with one word removed. And of course the answer is here. Why this particular word? Well, because I've decided that my students have a problem with the formation of passive forms, using the passive voice. So by removing this word, it's drawing students' attention to the way the passive form is produced using the verb to be. Very useful activities these for focusing on the little words of English, the grammar words, the non-lexical words, the boring words, if you like, the words which are not really used to carry any kind of meaning, but in fact they are, in my opinion, keywords in terms of developing fluency with the use of the language. And by ignoring and neglecting a focus on such words, I think we're doing our students a disservice and we're making it more difficult for them to acquire fluency. So another example of a simple way to focus on these little grammatical, non-lexical words, which appear, of course, everywhere in English text. This time, prepositions. This is the text, or part of the text, of the Battle of the Lifestyles. All I've done here is to take away all the prepositions which appear in the text, and I've replaced the prepositions with symbols. Of course, the same symbol always represents the same preposition. So logically, the more common prepositions, the more useful prepositions for students to know, occur more frequently and are therefore represented more frequently by particular symbols, such as the star symbol or the at symbol here. Some of the other symbols, like this one here, or the euro sign here, only appear once. Makes it more difficult perhaps for students to identify the prepositions by looking at the symbols, but do remember that students have already read the text a number of times in order to process the meaning. So I'm not going to reveal the answers to this. If you wish to refer back to the text, we can quickly go back to it. Where is it? Okay. So here is the text, and we're looking at, I think, the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. You can find the answers by identifying the prepositions that I've removed. Okay, so that's just a few examples of simple ways to focus on form, draw students' attention to the language which appears in the text. Let's move on to a final activity. I think, however engaged students are during the lesson itself, I think for deep level learning to take place, all the evidence suggests that at some point in the near future it will be necessary to return to the text, to revisit it in some way in order for students to see it again and for deep level memorization and deep level learning to occur. So a nice little way to do this, one simple activity in the next lesson or perhaps the next week. Refer students back to the text. In this case, we're going to look back to the fun route to fitness. Remember, students will have studied the text and read it in detail, not only to focus on the meaning, but also to focus on the forms of language within it. At this point, in a future lesson, prepare a list of 10 words related to the topic. Here you go. And tell students that 3 of these words did not actually appear in the text. So the student's task is to try and identify, try and remember which 3 words did not appear in the text. It's a difficult activity. For that reason, again, don't penalise students for getting the wrong answer. The important thing is just by thinking about it, they are revisiting the text, at least mentally. To check, you can give them the text, of course, to review it, to read it again. What you find, and the answers in this case, gym is one of them, computer is the other one. I can't even remember the other one. Maybe sports is the third one. I don't know. You'd have to check the text to find the answer. What's interesting, however, is that the brain tends to create its own meaning. It creates its own lines of thought and develops its own concepts based on what it reads. This happens in our own language, of course, and I think it happens in second language processing as well. So you will find that students become convinced that, for example, some words, the word computer, they think, well, it's a text about computer games. And using these for exercise purposes, students will convince themselves that the word computer appeared in the text because their brain will develop meanings around the idea of a computer and computer programs. In fact, it doesn't. And again, it doesn't matter. It's not important. It's not a question of getting it right. The important thing is the challenge contained within the activity itself. So, there we are. It's a very simple example of how to revisit a text. Of course, there are many other ways you can do this. All I wanted to do is just present one simple example. All of these texts, as I mentioned at the beginning, come from Kaplan International English K Plus Notes course books, our own series of course books. And if you would like to have more information about those books or about any of the ideas expressed in this presentation, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. Okay, I hope you found this useful, and I hope to be back with more presentations, more webinars very soon. Thank you. Bye.